Hi, I'm Roberta. Welcome to my garden. And I'm here today with
Help me.
one of my favorite chefs and one of my most annoying chefs, the
Help me.
wonderful David Thompson. I have no idea what we're going to talk about. I'll be lucky if I have any idea what we're going to cook because he's in charge. David, what do you want to tell our cook?
Look, you asked me a question earlier on how do you define Thai food or what are the characteristics? And it's a mouthful, both in the characteristics and what I have to say about it. It's such a nebulous thing, Roberta. It really is. So it is a mouthful, Roberta, literally in so many ways, because good Thai food is more than satisfying. It's memorable. How do you define it? I'm not really defining it because it's been so many years and I've been part of it for almost 30 years now, cooking it and mucking around with it. To me, it's instinctive. And like all old knowledge, it is instinctive and you know what it is when you taste it and you don't know, and you know what it isn't when you don't.
How do you know you're eating Thai food and not the food of one of the other neighbouring countries?
Well, again, this is another thing that's a little bit problematic because political borders, as they're now defined, change. And we've seen it change in Europe. We see it's changing in Europe even now. But in Thailand, Siam, at its greatest extent, started up near the borders of China and went right down to the borders of Singapore. And that was
Wow.
during Rama III's period, which is 200 years ago. And
So
so,
not that long
not
ago.
terribly long ago historically, but all of those people nodded to the throne of Siam, and uh, they had a political allegiance, but the food that it encompassed was of so many differing communities, where the composite was of different languages, different accents, different ethnic groups, different writing, different language, and different creeds.
Different religions?
Different
Yeah.
creeds too. Yes, you have Muslims, Buddhists, animists, a whole range of things, and so consequently, it's such a nebulous piece to try and define. Most people, however, know Thai food from the Central Plains, which is the dominant region of modern Thailand,
Right.
and that's Bangkok really, and the adjacent provinces. And in Thai it's called Hap Lang, which it literally does mean Central Plains or the central area, and that became more dominant as the from the toppling of the absolute monarchy in 32, where languages were quashed, regional differences were quashed, and you had a standardization of the food too, not consciously, but as people were drawn into the city, they
Yes.
absorbed certain aspects and habits of that city and its area. Um, Up until the 1950s, things like lap and all the northeastern food that abounds now in Bangkok was considered foreign by the Bangkokians.
Right.
It was builders' food. It was labourers' food. It was food that was déclassé at best. It was rustic, rude, and robust.
So we're finding in Thailand what we've found with the food of
Any
Europe.
other any other
Cucina povera
mm.
becomes popular eventually.
Well, it's more complicated than that because it's a different region altogether, and
Right.
they were considered a different people. You see, the Siamese was a group of various ethnic groups that held loyalty to the throne, but that was about the only thing they had in common,
Right.
apart from their religion. And so, you have the Central Plains Thai, then within them you have the Vietnamese, the Chams, all the various types of ethnic groups, the Chinese as well, the people from Java, the Muslims, the Arabs. Because Siam was a polyglot. It was a concentration of people that came from various parts of the world, including uh, aspect parts of Siam as well. And because they had such a eclectic culture, and also one that was rooted in the dirt, in the soil, and in the soul of Siam, they were very confident. So they absorbed so many foreign influences. The idea of frying up a curry paste, for instance, is came with the Arabs or with the Indians who ventured to Siam from 1400 onwards, if not earlier, much earlier.
Prior to that, they would have just been in water or stock.
They would have been boiled.
Yes.
And that's the oldest one. Before the chilies arrived, the idea of a curry was very, very different. As the Siamese ventured from the north down onto the Central Plains, they took with them many of their own habits, but they absorbed them because they were interpolators. They were the rude, rustic northerners who came into the more civilized lands. They changed their religion. They changed their religion and their denomination because previously they were animists, and you scratch the surface of any Thai Buddhist and they still are animists. And then they were followers of the higher chariot of Buddhism, and then they absorbed the Theravada tradition, the lower chariot, which was more austere as they moved on to the Central Plains. They are a changing people, and their cuisine changes, and the influences of that enter into their cuisine, that affect their cuisine, changes too. So I told you it was a mouthful.
It was a mouthful, and it's
And
fascinating.
I didn't answer any of the questions because what you wanted to know was how does it taste? I don't know.
Well, I have one question because you raised an interesting point. The chili came to Thailand and to Asia from the New World,
Yes.
and yet we can't imagine Thai food, especially not your Thai food. So, what did they use before the chili?
White peppercorn. Oh, peppercorns. Peppercorns are indigenous, and that's why in Thai they're called prick Thai. And other chilies were once called prick. Oh, I forget the old-fashioned name. My memory is slipping me. But essentially they were the foreigners' pricks, as it were.
As it were. So when we talk about rice being at the heart of the Thai diet,
It is a cornerstone. A meal is not a meal without rice.
right?
It's a snack. However complicated that snack might be to prepare, it's nonetheless a snack.
So these single dishes, the noodle dishes and things like that, are snacks,
They're food on the hop.
right?
They're not a proper meal.
So what does a proper meal consist of, typically?
Rice.
Anything else?
Yes. If the basis and the cornerstone of the cuisine is rice, then you have various different dishes that accompany it to give savour, to season to the rice.
Season.
And that's all they are. That's at their most basic, at the most primitive of definition. That's indeed what they are. Now, Westerners get it confused. Sometimes get it confused too, and they turn it around where the curry is more important and the relish is more important and so on. And they are more difficult to do, and they are more delicious. But the cornerstone, the basis, the foundation of the food is rice. And the misconception is merely based upon how it appears on the table, but also the influence of Westerners and how they eat their food too. And so there's been a transformation, indeed a turnaround, in how Thais approach their food over the last century, where Westerners have had some inroads into the country.
But they would still eat at least 50% rice?
Oh, at least. Yeah, otherwise their mums would wrap their little knuckles for being greedy.
Now,
But that's also why the food is often so spicy.
Yes.
It's not because it is when it hits the mouth. It is because it's not mixed with a sufficient degree of rice.
So it's 1 part curry to 2 or 3 parts rice. Typically.
Yes, and if you're poor, like in often the more spicier the food, because the more spicy the food means you need to use less of the protein, the more expensive thing, than the sustenance itself, rice.
Now, I think nothing tells me more the importance of rice in the Thai people's lives than the way you ask someone, how are you?
Which means ginkar riyang, which is have you eaten rice? It's just like have you eaten. And the assumption is if you've eaten, at least you can survive with it.
So literally, if I say to you, hi David, how are you? What I'm saying is, hi David, have you eaten rice today?
Yeah, you say banging nai as well, how are you going? There's many other ways of saying, but one of the old-fashioned ways was ginkar riyang, which means have you eaten today? And that was often done in the 19th century as slang, because you see at that stage, everybody was the chattel of the king. And so he could move whole villages wholesale from anywhere in his kingdom to anywhere else in his kingdom. And he did so. There's whole villages or whole areas of the south which was underpopulated that are full of northeasterners. And they still remember their food and they still cook that food. And so you have this juxtaposition of various ethnic groups or regional groups that compose the matrix, the carpet, that rich, complicated weave that forms the carpet of the cuisine of the country.
So that was one of the ways. That was one of the ways that the cuisine moved around the country, because the king could literally relocate populations.
But in the main, most people stayed where they were because as farmers,
They were tied to the land.
they were tied to the land literally, and their tithes that went to the king uh, was often in rice or in labour. And labour would be, and that's why they were moved around because some people would be moved great distances if the demand for labour or a project was being made, like digging a canal, for instance, around Bangkok. And that's why you had the Javanese that were just on the border. They're called Javanese, but in fact they're Malays. That moved up during the Rama III's period, and now have an area uh, on the opposite side of Bangkok, on the other side of the river, which is where I live, Thompson. And there they established many things, including, I suspect, the satay first went out on the streets.
Right. Now, we've talked about rice. What are a few other key elements that Thai food would be unimaginable without?
Shrimp paste,
Right,
which,
guppy,
guppy, which is the murky sole. The fish sauce, of course, sugar, the what else? Sugar, of course, palm sugar in the main, coconut cream, and of course your friend the chili.
my friend the chili,
Mm-hmm.
and the white pepper and the gingers are still there
Oh
as well.
yes,
Aren't
but
they?
they're all seasoning elements of particular dishes. But how can I put it? There are various dishes that are normally eaten with rice when you're sitting down to have a meal. A relish, for instance, which is perhaps the most important thing to have. It's based upon either coconut cream, simply with a fermented element like yellow beans or some old fish, or a numprik, which is literally means like a chili liquid. It's shrimp paste with chili that at its most basic that you eat with fresh vegetables.
Right.
And it works with rice. It adds savour with rice, and it's not bad with rice too.
I think we could talk about Thai food forever. I know you could. I think we need to get into the kitchen and show our cooks how to make some Thai food. We do. You like cooking, trust me.
You treat me like you're chef.
How do we say bon appetit in Thai? What do the Thais wish each other when they sit down to eat?
I don't bother talking. They just dive straight in, really. In the main, I don't know. They actually they're very polite. I joke about that. They'll wait until the senior person sits down and the senior person has had their first bite, and then they'll start to take. In olden days, they'd sit at separate tables, or rather, they'd have different dining times. The principal people would eat first, and then they'd leave food, which would then go down the various rungs of the household.
There is one other point that I've learnt from you that I think is worth sharing. Because it is a banquet and there are several dishes served together, do we put everything on our plate
No.
RSL Club style?
No, but you avoid your cheaper wedding type of behaviour.
Okay.
And you take one item first,
Yes.
a spoonful or two, because you don't want to appear to be too greedy or too hungry.
Right.
And then you have that, you mix that with rice, and then you move on to the next. There's no set sequence in the eating. You can move from one dish to another in any way you wish, according to your palate or preference. And you mix that with rice. You must always finish your rice. Doesn't matter about the other dishes, because they can always be held back for a later time. But whatever rice you put on your plate,
You must eat.
you should eat. That's the polite
That's
form.
respect.
Well, it's respect for the ingredient, for the farmers, and also to Mea Prasad, which is the rice goddess. Thais are deeply superstitious, and no matter how worldly, sophisticated, well-travelled, or wealthy they might be, you scratch the surface, and inside is somebody just as superstitious as the most remote of farmers. And I know so many businessmen who will not make a move without their astrologer or their
Really?
soothsayer. And I've actually had a business with one prominent family, wealthy family, who halted it simply because my birthday did not match with the chairman's.
Oh dear.
Yes, that's how much it is followed. The king has royal astrologers, and every ritual is determined by them, and how that ritual is done, how it winds out, is changed according to the time as well. It's because the Thais are not only Buddhist but also they're Brahmic and they're animist. There are so many traditions that are wound together that affect their society and affects their food too. And so you have this complicated mosaic that woven rub that I was talking about before that comes together, knots and all, dyspeptic knots and all, in order to create that wonderful mosaic called Thai food.
Well, we could talk about Thai food all day, but
I could babble on, but it doesn't give the same satisfaction as the proof of the pudding.
so how do we wind this up?
I say, Bai Hong Kua,
Which means
go to the kitchen.
it could mean anything, but let's believe him. Let's cook.